There is no doubt the world over that the risk debate has changed irrevocably, driven by political and economic uncertainty, disruptive technology, and different approaches taken by countries to survive and then flourish after the serious effects of the pandemic. And obviously, here in South Africa, the impact of widespread power cuts. Considering all of this, South Africa is eagerly awaiting the launch of the IRMSA 2023 South Africa Risk Report. It has become an influential must-read for key decision makers in the country. The report is going to build on IRMSA's role as a catalyst for positive change in South Africa, and it's reflected in the theme for 2023, Limitless. I'm joined today by Deresh Lawangee, who's the Chief Executive Officer at an organization called RISE. What does that mean? Well, retirement, investments, and savings for everyone. Deresh, a very warm welcome to you. Let's start with the big picture if we can.
Thank you, Jim.
How has the global and local risk landscape outlook changed, in your opinion, over the past year? I mentioned in my introduction just how difficult things are. I'm assuming that you would agree with me.
Yes, definitely would agree with you. Just starting off with global inflation has really impacted us. It's cemented itself as a problem in 2022, and we continue to deal with it now, particularly for the developing nations where they were not really used to, or developed nations where they're not really used to these high inflation rates. Cost of living costs have really increased for them, and they have to become accustomed to it. So the way central banks deal with high inflation is to increase interest rates. And so what you have is a lot of developed nations going from near zero interest rates to quite substantial interest rates. And that has changed the way in which businesses operate because the cost of capital has gone up. We were somewhat immune to that in some sense because we're used to a certain inflation rate and an high interest rate environment, not a near zero interest rate environment. So I think inflation and global interest has has become a significant risk from a global perspective. I also think climate change and leading to natural disasters coupled with the energy supply crisis is a risk. Green energy was somewhat abandoned last year with the Ukraine crisis in favor of fossil fuels in the short term, with some European nations capitulating on climate goals. I worry about who sets the agenda in this regard. Just some examples that I want to go through was, developed nations obviously built their economies without any of the ESG requirements and net zero carbon requirements that we face today. So emerging nations are expected to adhere to stricter ESG requirements. That's not really of our creation. But the counter argument to that is that emerging nations will then develop their economies in a much more sustainable way, on a net zero basis, but the rules keep on changing. And some of the anomalies I want to point out, for example, is that, in the US, coal power stations are shut down, but US still exports some of its coal to be burnt, obviously, elsewhere. Last year, we've seen Germany restart some of the coal power stations during the Ukraine war. This was a tweet that I seen last year when Russia was about to invade Ukraine, and Europe found itself discussing whether ESG should be listed as an ESG asset to grant them more favorable access to finance. And I termed that the weaponization of ESG. Ultimately, this wasn't passed when they discussed it. It was interesting that it was even on the table at the time, because at that point that was not the only international conflict that was happening around the world, and the timing of it was quite interesting. So often with the ESG rules that are put in place, I always debate, who sets the rules on these topics. And I think we see some of that coming through in some of the positions government has taken on the just transition. Not that it necessarily supports some of those positions. But I think it's important to understand who sets the agenda and make sure the agenda also suits us and our sustainable future, because it's a global problem. Low growth has been a problem globally, and especially with the slowdown in China and the slow reopening of China, it has really affected South Africa. So those are global risks that I look at. Locally, Eskom dominates the risk that we face. I made some points around, government lifting the IPP cap. That created a chain reaction that, in my view, could create a death spiral for Eskom, and I'll explain why. The lifting of the IPP cap created a tariff arbitrage. So we have some renewable energy projects, and in the round 5 renewable energy programs, you're bidding those projects in at around between 42 and 46 cents per kilowatt hour into the ESCOM grid. But now with the removal of the cap, you could sell that power directly to corporate and industrial players or even consumers at around 150 to 170, which is what they are paying at the moment. So that creates a huge tariff arbitrage for ESCOM. So what's going to happen, in my view, is that ESCOM is going to start losing paying customers as large corporate industrials and middle income and high income households go off the grid and become less reliant on the ESCOM infrastructure. And then ESCOM has to rely on the transition to split into the 3 units and become essentially a distributor of electricity and allow IPPs to wheel across their network. So I don't know if those commercials will stack up. I haven't looked at that, but I suspect not. So they won't be able to charge what they're charging us at the moment as consumers. So that will put them into a debt spiral that will ultimately become a fiscal burden for us. The other risk that ESCOM in this transformation needs to transform its grid, and the grid is a major hindrance at the moment. So there's a lot of IPP projects that that can't supply any electricity into the grid because of lack of grid infrastructure, and that's a huge risk. So you have to either consider expanding the grid, or developing closed grid systems, or maybe even invest in green hydrogen, and all 3 of those options will need investments. Locally, service delivery and government failings in that regard is it's a major risk. 2 weeks ago, I traveled out to Katu to look at some wind solar farm projects, and small town South Africa is in a deep crisis. So at that meeting where we met with local mines to see if we can assist with the energy solutions, the local farmers came along as well, and the mine wanted us to reserve some power for the local farmers, so because they can't operate. And at the rate we're continuing, I'm really afraid we're going to start causing a food crisis in the country, with rural South Africa on its knees, essentially. And then something a little bit more idiosyncratic to my industry, retirement investments, legislation in the pension fund space. So what I'm seeing is that National Treasury in general is increasingly looking at the retirement fund industry to solve some of the problems. I'll give you 2 examples. The first is early access to retirement funds to solve the problem of people not having access to capital. This is being implemented via the 2-pot system, which you've probably heard about, that creates a mechanism for people to access the retirement savings. That'll be effective from next year. I've said before in the media that access to capital is imperative in our economy because most people don't have access to financial services in general, particularly in the lower income markets, but the risk lays in the legislative uncertainty. At the moment, the 2-pot system allows you access to accumulated savings after the implementation date, which is March 2024. But there is a populist rhetoric where they want to allow access to accumulated savings before that implementation date, which could have dire circumstances. So I did write an article in that regard because there's a good case study of what actually happened. So this piece of legislation was actually inspired from what happened in Chile. And Chile, during the COVID crisis, allowed early access to retirement funds. And when they did that, they created an outflow of almost $50 billion US, which is 14% of the GDP. The currency obviously was impacted immediately and weakened. And the stock market was also went into a bit of a decline because you had asset managers in Chile having to sell long duration assets that were only supposed to be liquidated 20 or 30 years from now, being put on a fire sale to create liquidity for these withdrawals. 80% of people exercise the options to withdraw the retirement savings, and the statistic is 30% of pension fund accounts were totally depleted, making those people totally reliant on grants and on the government. Excuse me. So you can imagine if such statistics emerge or manifest itself in South Africa, many of those pensioners will become dependent on grants, further putting burden on the fiscus. So I see that as a risk. There's also National Treasury has increased the exposure to what pension funds can invest offshore in foreign markets, but they've coupled that with a requirement that we must report on how much retirement funds are investing in infrastructure development in South Africa. Um, my worry is that this is probably a precursor to prescribed assets. So you first want to measure something before you make a policy decision. So there's two ways to look at it. Firstly, um, prescribed assets agnostically can do good. It can do many good things. We can utilize that capital in a way that benefits the country. And also, if you look at the failings in corporate South Africa, particularly with Steinhoff and various other South African companies' forays into Australia and Nigeria, where pension fund capital was lost, there is an argument that we should be more patriotic and investing more directly in the country. But we operate in a very low trust environment with the government at the moment. And cynically, it can be viewed that the government is asking the pension fund industry to compensate for government's failings in terms of infrastructure development. So I use the word patriotic, and I always think about a quote I came across of Mark Twain, where he said, patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. So that debate is still there. Do we use pension fund assets to compensate for government's failings? Is it the patriotic thing to do, and how do we do that in a very low trust environment? And then finally, it's the unemployment rate is structurally high, and it could result in more protest, unrest, and racial tensions. The environment is such that we have immigration of skilled labor, and we're not replacing that skilled labor, and general outflow from emerging markets due to the macroeconomic environment.
So, Deresh, that is a very comprehensive list that you've outlined, and it's interesting that you raise inflation as a key problem as we're having this discussion right now. I see that food inflation in South Africa has now risen to its highest level since 2009. So, having given us that list, then, in your opinion, where do risk managers in the very short term need to focus their attention?
In the very short term, I think the increasing cost of capital, you got to make sure that your business is immune to that you can operate in that type of environment. Also, immediately, with the energy crisis, you got to make sure that your business and your operations are not going to be affected by the lack of electricity in the country at the moment.
Last year in the risk report, among the many risks that I identified were lack of leadership, crime was high, and that you have referenced the whole issue of power generation. In your opinion, then, which of the current risks that are highlighted in the upcoming report resonate with you? And maybe just give us a sense of your personal strategy in dealing with risk in this regard.
Yeah, I having read the report, I chose a bit of an odd one. I wanted to talk about large-scale interruption of digitally enabled services and economic activity. So I think we're very dependent on digitally enabled services, and with the advent of AI and that becoming more prominent and prevalent in industry, I wonder what happens when we become over-reliant on such technology. Also, I think there's a bit of skills transformation that we need to undergo. With very low skill workers having to upskill themselves, particularly with the AI and the Chat GPT. I think the focus will be more on understanding how the technology works, and what's going to become a nascent discipline is prompt engineering, understanding how to prompt this AI and to get the best out of it. Because if you can, there's a lot of benefit that organizations can get out of it. Mm-hmm. But what if those services stop working or they start giving us incorrect information and no one's checking and there's no checks and balances? I think that could be a risk that leaders need to start being cognizant about.
That is so interesting. And who would have thought that we're talking about that as a risk now, when a year ago something like that wasn't even on the horizon, which also tells me how quickly unexpected or unknown risk can come to the top of the pile. Just a final question then, Deresh. How do managers ahead of the release of this report need to change their thinking? How do they need to recalibrate the way in which they operate?
I think there's known risk that we can put down on an Excel spreadsheet and have mitigation plans around, and then there's the unknown risk. And by definition, you're you don't know when that is coming. And so we just need to have the capacity and have the foresight to be agile in those environments to make sure that your employees and your organization is immune to such risk. Some of them are systematic, so there's nothing you can do about that, like high inflation rates or high interest. So that's beyond our control. But I think the idea is to be agile and have an open mind so you can spot those risks coming down the line and react faster than your competitors.
And what I'm hearing is the key word there is agile or agility, because you simply add to the risk quotient if you don't teach yourself how to be agile. But often in becoming agile, it requires a change of thinking corporate-wide, and dare I say it, perhaps a little bit more courage within an organization to do exactly that.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good point. Think of this, our own organization. There's the fail fast type of mentality where, not deliberately, but employees have the ability to try something. If it doesn't work out, you fail fast and move on to the next thing with learnings from your failures, because failure can be a very good teacher. But I think that type of environment allows you to be more agile and more reactive to risks that you can't foresee on an Excel spreadsheet. Otherwise, people will just be paralyzed and won't know what to do.
Indeed, a very insightful and penetrating conversation. Deresh Lawangee, thank you very much indeed. You can see it on the screen there from the organization Rise. Appreciate your time and your input.
Thank you.